September 22, 1945, Camp Deming, New Mexico. Georg Gardner, a 24-year-old sergeant formerly with the RML Africa Corps, carefully crept beneath 2 layers of fencing under the cover of night. For several weeks he had observed the patterns of freight trains passing near the camp. That evening he would board one heading west, embarking on a journey that would last 4 decades, ultimately making him the last known German prisoner of war to evade return to Europe. Gardner hailed from Schwidnitz in Lower Silesia, a town that had vanished from Germany's map following World War II. Under the terms of the Potsdam Agreement, Schwidnitz was incorporated into Poland. Returning home now meant facing Soviet occupation, the risk of execution, or deportation to labor camps in Siberia. His flight across the desert was not merely an escape from a USO internment camp, it was a deliberate choice to seek life in the United States over returning to a homeland that no longer existed. Across 511 POW camps scattered from Maine to California, 371,683 German soldiers faced similar dilemmas. According to U.S. Army records, there were 2,222 documented escape attempts. By the end of repatriation, 7 prisoners were never accounted for, while many others resisted through legal appeals, intentional work slowdowns, and procedural delays. By 1946, the U.S. military had to resort to armed measures to compel the last holdouts onto ships bound for Europe. The decisions these men faced were often a stark calculus of survival, the choice between falling under Soviet control or remaining in American custody, enduring food shortages in post-war Germany, or risking illegal freedom in a foreign land, facing near-certain death under communist regimes, or an uncertain future as fugitives in the nation they had once fought. This existential struggle began on May 7, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally. For the 371,683 German POWs held in American camps, the war had ended. Yet for roughly 123,000 prisoners from regions now under Soviet occupation or transferred to Poland, Czechoslovakia, or the Soviet Union, the post-war nightmare was only starting. While the Geneva Convention's Article 75 required rapid repatriation after hostilities, the U.S. State Department later acknowledged in declassified documents that a crisis was unfolding. These prisoners could no longer return to Germany. East Prussia was under Soviet control, Silesia and Pomerania were now Polish, and the Sudetenlands had been absorbed into Czechoslovakia. By July 1945, camp authorities across the U.S. noted a rise in severe anxiety disorders among prisoners faced with mandatory repatriation. The psychological toll was significant, and in some cases deadly. 14 German POWs were executed by U.S. time. Authorities for killing fellow prisoners suspected of cooperating, while dozens of suicides may have been murders committed in fear of betrayal to the repatriation authorities. The most systematic resistance emerged at Fort Eustis, Virginia. Originally intended as a repatriation processing center, the fort became the hub of the largest organized anti-repatriation movement in U.S. military history. On January 6, 1946, the facility began screening 22,000 German prisoners through a contentious 6-day democracy course that would determine their eventual fate. Prisoners were categorized into 3 groups: white for anti-Nazi individuals, gray for politically neutral soldiers, and black for committed Nazis. Those assigned to the black category faced extended forced labor in Britain or France before being sent back to Germany, while white classified prisoners could return home directly. This classification system sparked immediate resistance. Prisoners soon discovered they could exchange identities. Whites sold their status to black classified officers in return for cigarettes, chocolate, and other goods. The arrangement collapsed when inconsistencies in age and rank became apparent during final processing. Lieutenant Colonel Alphys Smith, who had overseen similar programs at Fort Getty, Rhode Island, received the Legion of Merit for his work but recognized the inherent contradictions. Prisoners were expected to attend lectures on democracy while remaining confined indefinitely. By February 1946, resistance at Fort Eustis had evolved into a more organized form of passive defiance. Prisoners destroyed identification documents and claimed they could not be repatriated without proper certification. What had begun as administrative processing had transformed into a profound contest over freedom, identity, and survival in a world reshaped by the aftermath of total war. Reports of widespread illness quickly inundated the medical facilities at the camp. The hospital, originally designed for routine care, was operating at 10 times its intended capacity as prisoners developed symptoms that made leaving the camp impossible. To fully grasp the motivations behind prisoner resistance, it is essential to examine one of the most ambitious escape attempts in American history, the Papago Park breakout on December 24, 1944. Situated in Arizona, Camp Papago Park accommodated roughly 3,100 German prisoners, most of whom were naval personnel. Among them was Captain Jürgen Wartenberg, the commander of U-162. Planning for the escape spanned 3 months, culminating in the construction of a 178-foot tunnel stretching from the bathhouse to a point beyond the perimeter fence. The prisoners carefully disposed of approximately 30 tons of excavated earth by fabricating a volleyball court, claiming it was necessary to level the ground for recreation. On Christmas Eve, the escape unfolded while guards were preoccupied with holiday celebrations. Prisoners staged a diversionary party to draw attention away from the tunnel. 25 officers successfully slipped through the tunnel, not aiming for Germany but for Mexico, hoping to find a safe haven there. The aftermath of the breakout highlighted the impracticality of escape on American soil. Wartenberg was apprehended on January 28, 1945 after a local resident in Phoenix reported a man speaking English with a German accent while asking for directions to Mexico. 3 other U-boat officers were located 3 days later in a Phoenix park, having realized that Arizona's rivers existed largely on maps. Their punishment consisted of days on bread and water, equal to the duration of their freedom. Among all escape attempts, only Gail Gertner managed to achieve permanent success. After fleeing Camp Deming on September 22, 1945, Gertner boarded a freight train to California. Over the next 4 decades, he lived under the name Dennis F. Wilds, chosen from a migrant farm family he had traveled with in Arkansas. He worked various jobs including dishwasher, lumberjack, ski instructor at Sugar Bowl in Tahoe, and tennis coach. He obtained a Social Security card, married Jean Clark in 1964, and adopted her 2 children. Eventually, he became a construction estimator and architectural consultant, designing custom homes throughout Southern California. Despite being listed as wanted by the FBI, with J. Edgar Hoover personally signing his arrest warrant and posters distributed to 10,000 post offices, Gertner continued to live openly. In January 1952, he participated in a ski expedition to assist a train stranded in the Sierra Nevada. Life magazine captured images of the team, including Gertner, while FBI wanted posters remained visible in nearby post offices. In 1984, after marital pressure to disclose his past, Gertner revealed the truth. The following year, he collaborated with historian Arnold Kramer to write Hitler's Last Soldier in America. On September 11, 1985, he formally surrendered on NBC's Today Show to Bryant Gumbel. Legal authorities were confronted with an unusual dilemma. Escape from a prison camp was not a federal offense, and deportation was impossible because he had been brought to the United States involuntarily. He had never technically entered the country illegally, leaving the FBI and Immigration and Naturalization Service with no grounds for action. Finally, in November 2009, at age 88, Gertner became an American citizen in Denver. He passed away in Loveland, Colorado in 2013, having spent 68 years in the United States, the country he was originally meant to leave in 1945. While prisoners often resisted repatriation, many American farmers and businesses lobbied to retain them, citing significant economic contributions. In 1945, German prisoner of war laborers harvested 939 million pounds of vegetables and 568 million pounds of fruit, generating $230 million in agricultural value while earning just 80 cents per day for the U.S. government. Congressional records from February 1945 document lawmakers from rural states requesting an additional 100,000 laborers. The Great Western Sugar Company officially petitioned Congress to retain 3,121 German prisoners indefinitely to maintain agricultural productivity. During World War II, the Junior Simplot Company in Idaho, which would later become a major supplier of French fries to McDonald's, employed roughly 2,000 German prisoners of war in facilities dedicated to producing dehydrated potatoes for American troops in the Pacific Theater. This arrangement drew intense criticism from labor unions. Both the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, and the American Federation of Labor ran campaigns highlighting the plight of returning American soldiers who were struggling to find employment while former enemy combatants were performing agricultural labor on U.S. time. Soil. Union leaders framed this as a profound injustice, arguing that placing veterans at a disadvantage to former enemies was morally and economically indefensible. The tension between the agricultural sector's urgent labor demands and the organized labor movement's opposition created unusual political coalitions. Southern senators often aligned with Midwestern farmers to counter the influence of Northern industrial unions. Similarly, the Farm Bureau Federation opposed the American Legion's lobbying efforts. The War Manpower Commission required union involvement in recruiting labor, but this regulation frequently clashed with farmers' desperate need for workers. Military rules strictly forbade fraternization between American personnel and prisoners of war, with violations potentially punishable by court-martial. Despite these restrictions, documented cases of interpersonal relationships did occur. One notable example involved Second Lieutenant Elena Powell, an African-American Army nurse, and Frederick Albert, a German medic. They met at Camp Florence, Arizona, in 1944. Powell was among just 63 black nurses serving in the Army Nurse Corps and had been assigned to prisoner wards because military authorities assumed that racial prejudice would otherwise prevent meaningful interactions. When Albert received orders for repatriation in March 1946, Powell was pregnant. Citing their American-born child as a legal basis, Albert successfully secured permission to immigrate and returned to the United States in 1947. The couple married on June 26, 1947, in Manhattan, one of only 16 states that allowed interracial marriage at the time. Research by Barbara Schmitter-Heisler, published in From German Prisoner of War to American Citizen 2013, estimates that about 5,000 former German prisoners ultimately immigrated to the United States, with roughly 1,200 marrying American women. Due to deliberate suppression of these figures by the military, exact statistics are impossible to verify. The intense resistance to these developments had a concrete precedent. Operation Keelhaul, conducted between August 14, 1946 and May 9, 1947, forcibly returned approximately 2.75 million Soviet nationals from territories under Western Allied control. Subsequent intelligence assessments indicated that roughly half of these individuals were executed or sent to Siberian labor camps. The McNaney-Clark Directive, issued by U.S. commanders, explicitly allowed for forced repatriation, regardless of individual consent, and remained classified until 1975. This directive demonstrated that coercive repatriation policies were not limited to Soviet citizens. German prisoners from Eastern Europe witnessed these events firsthand. At Camp Shanks, New York, they observed Soviet captives being herded onto trains, sometimes leading to suicides among prisoners who preferred death to return. Such scenes convinced many German prisoners from territories occupied by the Soviet Union that resistance or escape offered the only viable path to survival. Legal developments reinforced the military's authority over prisoner handling. The Supreme Court case Johnson v. Eisentrager 1950 established that German nationals detained by U.S. forces could not petition American courts for habeas corpus. This ruling retroactively legitimized the military's position that prisoners of war had no legal means to contest repatriation. Congressional debates reflected the competing pressures of labor needs and humanitarian considerations. In February 1945, representatives from agricultural states formally requested the continued retention of 100,000 German prisoners to address labor shortages. These requests, however, focused on extending detention strictly for labor purposes rather than granting any form of permanent residency. In June 1945, the State Department reclassified German prisoners as surrendered enemy personnel or disarmed enemy forces, thereby circumventing Geneva Convention protections while allowing for extended detention. Military records document at least 56 confirmed suicides among German prisoners of war between 1943 and 1946, underscoring the human cost of these policies. In March 1946, the International Red Cross published findings on the situation in American prisoner of war camps, estimating that the number of deaths likely surpassed 200. Many fatalities have been recorded as accidents, apparently to avoid closer examination. The crisis reached a critical point in December 1945 when 5 detainees at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, took their own lives within a single week after being notified of repatriation orders to the Soviet-occupied zone. In response, the War Department issued Emergency Directive 411 on January 15, 1946, mandating suicide prevention measures, including the removal of belts, razors, and ropes from prisoner possession. Rural communities across the United States actively lobbied to retain German prisoners for labor. In Kansas, Camp Concordia developed such a close-knit rapport with its 4,000 prisoners that the town continues to hold annual reunions decades later. In Wisconsin, Douglas County credited 2,140 German prisoners with salvaging the entire 1,945 cherry harvest, collecting a total of 58,020 pails of fruit. Texas farmers, facing a shortage of 300,000 agricultural laborers, became heavily reliant on prisoner labor, leading to widespread opposition to camp closures. The Spokesman Review reported multiple instances where local residents physically obstructed roads to prevent military authorities from transporting prisoners for repatriation. By March 15, 1946, at Pier 51 in Staten Island, the Liberty ship General Sturgis stood ready to carry 1,500 German prisoners to Bremerhaven. When buses arrived from Fort Dix, longshoremen discovered prisoners so reluctant to board that many had to be forcibly escorted onto the vessel. The International Longshoremen's Association threatened to strike rather than handle the shipment of unwilling individuals. Camp Shanks in New York, the principal deportation center, was constructed to process approximately 1,000 prisoners each week, yet by April 1946, it was managing 5 times that number. On April 22, 30 detainees attempted a daring escape by climbing through the barracks floors and crawling into the sewage system. 27 were swiftly recaptured, while 3 reached the Hudson River before being intercepted by Coast Guard patrol boats. Between March and July 1946, Navy documentation confirms 17 suicides during Atlantic crossings, though deaths attributed to accidents or recorded as missing at sea suggest the actual toll may have been higher. Meanwhile, conditions in Germany between 1945 and 1947 were catastrophic. In the British-occupied zone, official daily rations provided only 1,040 calories, insufficient for basic survival, and winter rations dropped even further during 1946 to 1947. Infant mortality rates doubled, and Herbert Hoover reported a 40% rise in mortality among Germans over 70. By autumn 1946, approximately 1/5 of German housing had been destroyed. The forced expulsion of 12 million Germans from eastern territories produced a humanitarian crisis of unparalleled scale. Industrial production in 1947 remained at only 1/3 of 1938 levels, while per capita food output reached just 51% of pre-war norms. For prisoners returning from Soviet-controlled areas, repatriation often carried the threat of execution or forced labor. During the Soviet occupation, an estimated 2 million German women suffered sexual assault, and entire factories were dismantled as war reparations. German men aged 16 to 60 faced a high likelihood of deportation to Soviet labor camps. From 1945 to 1947, U.S. congressional records reveal intense lobbying from agricultural states to retain prisoner labor. In May 1945, following complaints from civilians about prisoner treatment, the Office of the Provost Marshal General restricted access to food and shut down canteen sales, prompting work stoppages among prisoners whose conditions had not improved despite Germany's surrender. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, U.S. officials defended the extended detention of German prisoners of war by citing the absence of a functioning German government. They argued that, because formal peace had not been established, the conditions outlined in Article 75 of the Geneva Convention permitted continued custody. New classifications for detainees were introduced, allowing the Allies to retain surrendered and disarmed German forces for labor purposes, while circumventing full Geneva protections. President Truman ultimately mandated the repatriation process, despite significant pressure from the agricultural sector, though logistical concerns such as crop harvests delayed the return of some POWs well into 1948. The last German prisoners held in the United States were not repatriated until the summer of 1946, and many had already spent additional years performing forced labor in Britain and France. The sheer numbers reflect the scale of this effort. 371,683 Germans were held in American camps, 2,222 escape attempts were documented, 7 prisoners were never accounted for, 14,000 repatriations were postponed to meet agricultural demands, and roughly 5,000 former POWs later immigrated to the United States as lawful residents. Broader immigration trends saw 580,000 Germans move to the US during the 1950s and 210,000 in the 1960s. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 further allowed 415,000 displaced individuals to settle in America by 1952, of whom around 60,000 were Germans. Many former POWs were included in these figures, though precise tracking remains difficult due to incomplete immigration records. The economic contributions of German POWs in the United States were substantial. Prisoners supplied 14 million man-days of labor in agriculture and processed 100 million board feet of lumber, amounting to an estimated $230 million in labor value. They earned a daily wage of 80 cents, which was paid directly to the U.S. government. POWs worked in 46 states, addressing acute labor shortages, constructing infrastructure, harvesting crops, and sustaining industrial operations that might have otherwise failed. Communities employing these workers often became their most vocal advocates, supporting extended retention. The U.S. military also initiated a covert re-education initiative known as the Special Projects Division, which engaged approximately 40,000 German prisoners. The program included the publication of the camp newspaper Der Ruf and the distribution of literature previously banned under the Nazi regime. By the end of hostilities in Europe, 25,000 prisoners had completed courses on democratic governance, returning directly to Germany instead of being sent to labor in Europe. Across the camps, 135 newspapers were produced. By 1945, while a minority of these publications still promoted Nazi ideology, most had shifted their focus to democracy and reconstruction. Several notable graduates of the U.S. re-education program went on to significant roles in post-war Europe, including Walter Hallstein, who became the first president of the European Commission, Hans Kroll, later West Germany's ambassador to the United States, and Rudiger von Wechmar. The Displaced Persons Act also offered a legal avenue for former POWs to emigrate. Between 1948 and 1952, around 5,000 German ex-prisoners successfully immigrated under its provisions, which required American sponsors, proof of non-affiliation with the Nazi Party, and evidence of financial self-sufficiency. Research by Barbara Schmitter-Heisler, drawing on 35 interviews with former POWs, highlights their successful integration into American society, with many rising to prominence as entrepreneurs, engineers, and civic leaders. Their descendants today form a substantial segment of German-American communities. Beyond the United States, German POWs faced further compulsory labor in Europe. Britain received 175,000 prisoners who worked until 1948, with 25,000 remaining as civilian laborers. France held 740,000 POWs, retaining many until 1949 to assist with post-war reconstruction. While these extended detentions contravened Geneva Convention stipulations requiring rapid repatriation, they were rationalized as part of war reparations. The final German prisoners were not released from Allied custody until 1949, 4 years after the conflict ended. Memoirs and first-hand accounts, such as Louis Carlson's We Were Each Other's Prisoners 1997, based on over 150 interviews, document a widespread preference among German POWs. A 1985 reunion in Austin, Texas, brought together over 500 former prisoners whose testimonies, preserved in archives, consistently emphasized the superior treatment they received in captivity compared to post-war civilian life in Germany. Arnold Kramer's decades-long interviews with former POWs found that 95% rated their experience in U.S. camps as good or excellent, and many maintained long-term correspondence with American families after returning home. The transformation of German prisoners from enemies to potential citizens is also evident in multiple government reports. The U.S. State Department recognized that POWs exposed to democratic values and material prosperity often became inadvertent ambassadors for American ideals upon their return to Germany. After World War II, U.S. military intelligence noted a striking trend among German prisoners of war assigned to American farms. Many developed a stronger sense of attachment to the local communities where they worked than to their homeland. These insights played a key role in shaping post-war policies toward both enemy soldiers and displaced individuals. While exact figures are difficult to ascertain partly due to intentional military suppression, existing records document hundreds of personal relationships formed between POWs and American women. Between 1946 and 1950, the Immigration and Naturalization Service logged more than 3,000 inquiries from USS women hoping to sponsor former prisoners for immigration. The majority of these requests were denied as prevailing regulations excluded former enemy combatants from the normal immigration quotas. Nonetheless, roughly 1,200 former POWs ultimately married American women, either by re-entering the country through legal channels or by meeting later under different circumstances. Escape attempts were rare. Out of 371,683 prisoners, only 2,222 tried to flee, representing a minuscule 0 to 6% rate, far lower than comparable figures in other nations. Most escapees were apprehended within a single day, as the vast distances, unfamiliar language, and absence of local support made successful flight nearly impossible. 7 prisoners were never accounted for by the time the final repatriations took place. Among the notable cases, Georg Gartner was documented, and Kurt Rossmiel lived under the alias Frank Ellis in Chicago for 14 years before voluntarily surrendering in 1959. The remaining 5 either perished or quietly assimilated into American society under assumed identities. Communities that advocated to keep German POWs locally often reaped tangible benefits. For example, the Junior Simplot Company, which relied in part on POW labor, eventually grew into a billion-dollar business. Moreover, German prisoners introduced innovative agricultural practices, particularly in irrigation and sugar beet cultivation, that left a lasting mark on American farming. Many former POWs who later immigrated to the U.S. became successful entrepreneurs. Their experience with American agricultural and business operations during captivity offered them unique advantages in post-war commerce. Several established enterprises that evolved into major employers, further contributing to the growth of their new communities. The reluctance of German POWs to return to Europe also influenced U.S. Cold War policy. Fears of Soviet occupation aligned with American concerns over communist expansion, and the stories of forced repatriation served as powerful propaganda illustrating the oppressive nature of communist regimes. The precedent set during this post-war period that individuals escaping communist control warranted special consideration later shaped US OFI. Responses to Hungarian refugees in 1956, Cuban refugees after 1959, and Vietnamese refugees in 1975. Although 511 POW camps were established across the United States, few physical structures remain. Many were repurposed or demolished, yet their historical influence endures through museums, local historical societies, and annual gatherings. For instance, Alona, Iowa hosts a dedicated POW museum. Arnold Kramer famously observed that America won the propaganda battle by demonstrating reality rather than preaching it, a conclusion widely echoed in scholarship. Powers observed American prosperity, participated in democratic processes, and experienced humane treatment. Their gradual shift from Nazi soldiers to engaged citizens of a democratic society occurred largely through exposure and lived experience rather than formal indoctrination. The last organized repatriation efforts concluded by the summer of 1946, though individual cases stretch beyond that date. Military records indicate that 14,000 POWs had their return postponed specifically to continue working in agriculture, technically in violation of the Geneva Conventions. Nonetheless, the overall program demonstrated how pragmatic engagement with former enemies could produce enduring benefits for both the individuals involved and the wider society. Transport ships carrying prisoners unwillingly sent back to Europe painted a grim picture of human suffering. Accounts from Captain Harold Morrison of the Marine Phoenix describe widespread hunger strikes, repeated suicide attempts, and episodes of collective panic among detainees who feared they were being delivered into Soviet hands. These reports underscore the intense psychological strain experienced during the repatriation process. Once released, former prisoners of war played pivotal roles in reconstructing post-war Germany. They introduced American techniques in agriculture, modern business methods, and principles of democratic governance, which in turn became blueprints for economic renewal. For example, Walter Holstein, who received education at Fort Getty, contributed to the design of the European Economic Community, while Hans Kroll, formerly interned at Camp Shelby, strengthened German-American relations in his capacity as an ambassador. Similarly, Rudiger von Wettmar held at Camp Herne advanced initiatives in international cooperation through the United Nations. The National Archives retains extensive collections of records from German prisoner camps, though a significant portion remains either classified or was deliberately destroyed following standard military procedures. Surviving artifacts include camp newspapers, photographs, and official administrative files. Additionally, universities and historical societies have preserved oral histories from both former POWs and US personnel. These first-hand accounts, recorded before participants passed away, provide invaluable insights into daily life, interpersonal dynamics, and social structures within the camps. The crisis surrounding the repatriation of prisoners also set notable legal precedents. In Johnson v. Eisendrager, the court reaffirmed military authority over enemy combatants. The subsequent reclassification of POWs as disarmed enemy forces established legal categories that continue to spark debate in international law. These precedents influenced how combatants were treated in subsequent conflicts, including Korea and Vietnam, and continue to shape modern military detention policies. Issues surrounding forced repatriation, prisoners' rights, and interpretations of the Geneva Conventions remain highly relevant today. Research has also shown the long-term societal effects of hosting POW camps. Communities that developed positive interactions with prisoners frequently benefited economically through subsequent visits. These included destroying identification papers, simulating illnesses that required hospital care, slowing down work, organizing strikes, manipulating classification assignments, failing democracy screening tests intentionally, and mass non-compliance at departure points. While these tactics could not ultimately prevent repatriation, they delayed the process considerably and demanded significant resources from the military to manage. The International Committee of the Red Cross investigated the conditions under which prisoners were returned, raising concerns over potential violations of the Geneva Conventions. A March 1946 report highlighted the severe psychological distress faced by detainees being sent back to Soviet-occupied territories. American military chaplains also documented moral dilemmas as personnel struggled to reconcile obedience to orders with a desire to protect prisoners from foreseeable persecution. Archival records from the military shed light on the intense moral dilemmas faced within the post-war repatriation framework. German prisoners of war, POWs, who chose to resist returning home after World War II were not merely acting out of personal desperation. Their actions reflected a broader affirmation of American ideals. These individuals made deliberate, calculated choices shaped by their exposure to the economic prosperity and democratic institutions in the United States, which stood in stark contrast to the ruin and uncertainty awaiting them in post-war Germany. Out of 371,683 German POWs held by American forces, 2,222 attempted to flee captivity, 7 vanished without a trace, and roughly 5,000 eventually returned to the U.S. through legal channels. These figures illustrate a profound transformation from enemy combatants to prospective citizens, from detainees to community members, and from defeated soldiers to adherents of democratic principles. Georg Gartner's extraordinary journey as the last fugitive German POW in America exemplifies this transition. Living under a false identity for decades, his successful integration into American society and eventual surrender in 1985, followed by USS citizenship in 2009, demonstrated that former adversaries could become fully contributing members of their adopted nation. The debate over retaining German POWs also highlighted economic tensions. Their labor represented an estimated $230 million in agricultural value and filled critical gaps during wartime shortages. At the same time, organized labor pushed for priority in employment for returning American veterans. This clash underscored larger questions about the balance between economic pragmatism, ethical responsibility, and international obligations. Personal relationships forged between POWs and Americans further challenged existing prejudices. Approximately 1,200 marriages arose from these interactions, defying wartime regulations and transcending national boundaries. These bonds endured despite prolonged separations, demonstrating the human capacity to overcome entrenched animosities. In contrast, the forced repatriation of Soviet nationals under Operation Keel Haul cast a stark shadow over German POWs from Eastern Europe. Witnessing these operations convinced many German detainees that resisting return was essential for survival. Policies such as the McNaney-Clark directives, which authorized coercion irrespective of POW consent, confirmed these fears. Programs like Fort Eustis's democratic screening, which processed 22,000 prisoners through extensive classification systems, often provoked resistance rather than cooperation. POWs quickly recognized the paradox of being taught democratic ideals while simultaneously denied freedom. Life in captivity often seemed preferable to returning to Germany. With rationing at 1,040 calories per day, devastated cities and Soviet occupation looming, the hardships of American camps were seen as a relative refuge. These conditions contributed to suicide attempts, escape efforts, and organized resistance, all meticulously documented in military records. Congressional debates of the period reveal tensions between agricultural needs and labor rights, and between practical economic decisions and obligations under international law. The postponement of 14,000 repatriations to meet agricultural demands demonstrated how economic interests could override Geneva Convention mandates. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948 ultimately provided legal avenues for POWs to remain in the U.S. Around 5,000 former prisoners successfully immigrated, building lives as citizens, entrepreneurs, and community leaders. Their experiences confirmed that transformation from enemy to integrated citizen was achievable. Beyond individual cases, these dynamics influenced the broader wave of German immigration, contributing to 580,000 arrivals in the 1950s and 210,000 in the 1960s, many directly or indirectly shaped by prior POW experiences. Notable former POWs who attained prominence such as Walter Holstein, Hans Kroll, and Rüdiger von Weher exemplified the potential for reconciliation. Exposure to democratic values enabled these individuals to assist in Germany's post-war reconstruction and foster international cooperation, validating the American investment in their development. The preservation of POW camp histories through museums, archival collections, and annual reunions continues to honor this legacy. Communities in locations like Alona, Iowa, and Hearne, Texas, host gatherings that celebrate transformation and reconciliation rather than lingering conflict, serving as enduring reminders of the capacity for former enemies to become allies. Historical research demonstrates that the way the United States managed German prisoners of war after World War II, despite the controversies surrounding forced repatriation, played a significant role in turning former adversaries into democratic supporters. Unlike programs that relied on direct indoctrination, the American approach emphasized practical demonstration of values and opportunities, which proved far more effective in fostering genuine allegiance. The legal questions raised during the repatriation debates set enduring precedents that continue to shape contemporary policies on military detention. Issues regarding prisoner rights, involuntary return to home countries, and interpretations of the Geneva Conventions remain highly relevant in modern conflicts. The experience of those German POWs who ultimately refused to return home provides a window into a broader human story that extends beyond the immediate context of war. These individuals, once defined solely as enemies, encountered in the United States a society that offered possibilities they had previously been conditioned to reject. Within the confines of prisoner camps, they discovered a space where hope, autonomy, and personal dignity were tangible even if still restricted by captivity. Their refusal to leave America was not a passive act. It was a conscious embrace of opportunity over familiarity, of uncertain futures over the known horrors of the past. They arrived under guard, yet many fought with determination to remain, and a number succeeded in establishing new lives on American soil. Their journey from combatants to citizens stands as a profound illustration of the country's capacity for moral renewal. The very institutions intended to confine them became gateways to integration and new beginnings. The nation they had once opposed transformed in their eyes from enemy territory into a home they consciously chose to inhabit. This transition is well documented through military records, congressional hearings, and historical scholarship, confirming that even in the aftermath of conflict, transformation is possible, adversaries can become collaborators, and prisoners can experience freedom even amid restrictions. For those German POWs who declined repatriation, the act was more than a mere escape from a past. They were actively moving toward a future. Their decisions underscore a broader truth about America's societal promise, that its principles of democracy and personal liberty resonate beyond national origin or political allegiance, and that human dignity can endure even in the shadow of war's destruction. The impact of these choices is not confined to the individuals themselves. Their influence extends to subsequent generations, to communities that supported and protected them, and to the legal and moral precedents their cases established. In many ways, the enduring significance of their story lies not in military triumph but in a moral victory, demonstrating that freedom, when made visible and accessible, can reshape former enemies into productive members of a democratic society. The legacy of those who chose to remain exemplifies the transformative potential of witness liberty, showing that the power of a society to redeem and integrate rivals is one of its deepest strengths.